The late sun burned the sky into strips of crimson over the cracked earth of New Mexico. Wind came rushing off the mesas, carrying dust and heat that blurred the horizon. Caleb Morton tightened the reins on his old horse, his gray eyes sweeping the emptiness like a man too familiar with silence. Since the sickness had taken his wife and 2 young sons, he'd moved through life like a ghost drifting between the lonely trails and the broken fences of his ranch at Dry Creek. This time, something on the ground made him pull up short. At first, it looked like the carcass of an animal, left to rot in the desert Sunday. But as Caleb swung down from the saddle and stepped closer, the outline sharpened. A woman. Her skin was dark and sunburned, her shoulders broad, her arms strong once, but they were laced with purple welts from a whip. Her wrists were bound with a strip of rawhide, and her breath came in shallow, uneven flickers, as if clinging to the thinnest thread of life. Caleb knelt, pressing his fingers to her neck. A faint pulse trembled beneath his touch. He let out a low curse. The warnings he'd heard echoed in his head. Stay out of Apache business, Morton. Meddle in their affairs and you'll earn their war. He looked around. The desert was empty, silent but for the wind. No riders, no sign of a trap, just the stillness of a woman abandoned to die. If he left her, she wouldn't last an hour. Caleb stood there for a long breath, jaw tight. Then he drew his knife, cut through the rawhide, and hauled her upright. She was heavy, dead weight across his arms, smelling of dust, blood, and heat. With a grunt, he slung her over the back of his horse. "Damn it," he muttered, swinging into the saddle. His boot kicked the flank, and the horse surged forward, kicking up a storm of red dust behind them. The wooden gate of the Morton Ranch creaked wide as he rode through. Caleb slid down, gathered the woman into his arms, and carried her inside the weather-beaten cabin. He spread an old blanket near the fireplace and lowered her onto it with more care than he'd expected from himself. The fire crackled to life, throwing flickers of yellow light across his worn, sun-darkened face. He filled a cloth from the last bucket of water precious as gold in this season and gently wiped the dust and dried blood from her skin. Her chest rose, faint but steady. She was alive, for now. Caleb sat back against the wall, rifle within reach, his gaze fixed on the door rattling under the desert wind. He didn't know who she was, nor why she had been left for dead. But one thing had become certain. If someone came tonight to finish what they started, Caleb Morton would be the man standing in the doorway. Night came down hard over Dry Creek, carrying the chill that always followed the desert heat. Inside the cabin, the fire Caleb Morton had lit sputtered against the draft, sneaking through the cracks in the timber walls. He crouched beside the woman, watching the rise and fall of her chest shallow, uneven but stronger than before. Her eyelids fluttered. With a sudden jolt, she sat up, eyes wide, breath ragged. Her hand shot out, seizing the small kitchen knife lying by the stove. The steel glinted in the firelight. Caleb didn't move. He raised his hand slowly, his voice low and steady, like talking to a skittish horse. "If you're gonna stab me, do it clean," he said. "But if you want to live, put the knife down." The woman's chest heaved. Sweat beaded along her brow, catching the glow of the flames. Her dark eyes darted around the cabin walls, weathered gray, shelves bare, a roof patched too many times. Not a prison, just a man's solitude. Then her gaze settled back on him. Tall, lean, with a face carved by sun and grief, unshaven and unflinching. Caleb kept his tone calm. "I cut your bonds. If you want to leave, the door's right there. Out there's nothing but hot sand and vultures." The knife trembled in her grip. Seconds stretched like hours. Finally, she exhaled hard and let the blade fall with a dull clatter against the floorboards. Her body collapsed back onto the blanket, all strength drained. Caleb stepped forward, picked up the knife, then set it back on the table, not hidden, just out of reach. He pulled a small wooden bowl from the shelf, poured the last of the water, and knelt again. "Drink," he said simply. "You need it more than I do." Her hand shook as she took the bowl, sipping slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Suspicion flickered in every glance, as if she were waiting for the trick, the trap. But Caleb didn't push. He stood, moved to the doorway, and lowered himself onto the porch steps. The rifle rested across his lap, the red ember of his cigarette glowing in the moonlight. Inside, She tilted her head, peering at him through the open door. A lone silhouette against the desert night, unmoving, steady as stone. Each time the nightmares tugged her back to the edge of fear, she opened her eyes and saw him still there, never coming in, never leaving. And something strange began to stir in her chest, something she thought had long since been beaten out of her. A flicker of safety. By the time the first pale light crept across the horizon, Caleb had not shifted from his post. He turned his head just enough for his words to reach her. "You can stay till you're strong again," he said quietly. "Or you can walk away when you're ready. Choice is yours." The woman said nothing, but her hand tightened on the blanket around her shoulders. And that, more than words, was her answer. The desert night had its own kind of silence, heavy, watchful, filled with the memory of heat that still clung to the earth. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, leaving only a bed of glowing coals. The woman lay curled under the old blanket, her breath shallow but even. Caleb Morton sat in his chair near the hearth, rifle across his knees. He had dozed now and then, but sleep never came easy. Not since the fever had swept through his home years ago, stealing the laughter of children and the quiet comfort of his wife. Sometimes he swore he could still hear them in the walls, the echo of his boy's boots clattering across the floor, the faint lullaby his wife hummed as she rocked the baby to sleep. Now the house gave back nothing but emptiness. He rubbed a hand across his face, eyes catching on the shadow of the woman stretched out by the fire. Her name, he didn't know it yet. Her story, he didn't need to ask. The scars across her back, the rawhide still fresh on her wrists, told enough. Cast out, punished, left for the buzzards. A sound broke the silence. A whimper. Caleb's head turned. She twisted in the blanket, her brow furrowed, lips moving as if calling out for someone she'd lost. A single word escaped, faint, broken, maybe a mother's name, maybe just a ghost in her dream. Her body jerked, as if the pain had followed her even into sleep. Caleb watched, his chest tight. He knew that feeling, dreams that dragged you back into the fire, made you live it again and again. He almost reached out but stopped, his hand curling into a fist. What comfort could he give? He was no savior, just another lost soul. Still, when her eyes flew open, wide and terrified, they met his. For a long moment, neither moved. The coals glowed, painting the room in shades of red, like blood and fire. She studied him, lean face, gray eyes steady, no threat in his posture. He studied her strong frame, battered yet unbroken, fear still clinging to her like a second skin. It struck Caleb then. They were the same. Two ghosts, walking the edge of a world that no longer wanted them. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "You're safe here, at least for tonight." Her lips parted, but no words came. Only a long, searching look, like she was trying to decide if she could believe him. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It held something else, an understanding that neither asked for, but both recognized. She sank back onto the blanket, her eyes still on him, until they finally slid closed. Caleb leaned into the chair, the weight of the rifle comforting across his lap. Outside, coyotes howled under the moon, but inside the cabin, two haunted souls kept watch, one awake, one asleep, bound by nothing but the knowledge that they were no longer entirely alone. Morning light spilled across the mesa, painting the land in gold and rust. The desert air was cool for a brief hour before the sun's weight pressed down again. Caleb Morton stepped outside the cabin, pulling on his worn hat, the rifle slung over his shoulder out of habit. The fences sagged in places, boards split, nails pulled loose by years of wind. A man could spend a lifetime patching this land and still lose the battle. Behind him came the soft scrape of wood against wood. He turned. The Apache woman, still wrapped in the old blanket, had risen to her feet. Her movements were stiff, her shoulder bound in rough cloth, but her gaze was sharp. She stood there a moment, as if testing the strength in her legs, then followed him out into the yard. Caleb didn't speak. He crouched by a broken fence post, pulling out nails with a rusted hammer. Sweat already clung to his brow. He expected her to sit in the shade, to watch in silence, maybe even walk off toward the horizon. Instead, he heard the creak of the water bucket. He glanced over his shoulder. She was hauling it up from the tank with both hands, her arms straining, muscles bunching under sun-darkened skin. She set the full bucket down with a heavy thud and wiped her forehead, meeting his eyes for a beat before looking away. Caleb studied her a long moment, then returned to his work without a word. The day moved in small rhythms. He patched boards, mixed mud to seal cracks in the wall. She carried stones from the arroyo, stacking them along the base of the fence to brace it against the wind. Her silence was constant, but not hostile. It was the silence of someone who had lived too long with only her own breath for company. By midday, Caleb paused, leaning on the hammer. His gaze slid again toward her. She was bent low, hauling a beam of wood heavier than most men could manage, setting it into place with grim determination. A shadow of surprise touched his face. He hadn't expected her strength. That evening, when the sun bled red across the horizon, Caleb was ready to call it quits. His back ached, his hands raw. But before he could, she stepped forward, took the hammer from his grip, and finished driving the last post into the ground. The crack of iron on wood echoed sharp in the dry air. Caleb stood silent, then gave a single nod. No words of thanks, just a quiet acknowledgement. She nodded back, sweat shining on her brow, chest heaving, but her posture proud. When night came, the cabin smelled of rabbit stew. She had lit the kitchen fire without asking, chopped meat, boiled broth, and set a wooden bowl in front of him. Caleb looked at the stew, then at her. No words passed between them. He lifted the spoon, took a bite, and nodded once more. For the first time in years, supper wasn't eaten in silence, but in company. The desert cooled slowly after sundown, the heat of the day still bleeding from the earth in soft waves. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and cracked, throwing light across rough-hewn walls and the worn faces of two people who had spent the day side by side. Caleb Morton sat in his chair, boots stretched toward the hearth, his body heavy with the honest ache of labor. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to work with someone else, two sets of hands instead of one. Across the room, the Apache woman crouched by the fire, stirring the last of the stew, her features quiet in concentration. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened, grown familiar, like the hush that settles over land after a storm. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. "Why did you save me?" The question hung in the air, carried on the crackle of the fire. Caleb didn't look at her right away. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the glowing coals, as if searching for the right words in their shifting light. He thought of the fever that had taken his wife, the small hands of his boys going cold in his own. He thought of the grave markers out back, worn smooth by wind. He had stood by helpless once, watching life slip away. He couldn't stomach it again. When he finally answered, his voice was rough but even. "Because I've seen too much death. Couldn't walk away from another." The woman's dark eyes studied him, long and searching, as if weighing his words against all the betrayal she'd known. Her lips pressed together, then softened. She gave a single nod, not in gratitude, but in recognition. Caleb shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. He wasn't a man given to explanations, and the truth sat raw in his chest. Still, he didn't regret saying it. For the first time, she set the spoon down and sat across from him. Not curled in suspicion, but upright, present. The firelight traced the scars along her arms, the evidence of whips and bindings, but it also caught the unbroken steel in her posture. They sat like that for a long time. Two silhouettes outlined by fire, bound not by words but by what each had lost. Outside, the coyotes called to each other under a silver moon. The wind rattled the shutters. Yet inside, for the first time in years, Caleb felt something other than emptiness pressing against his chest. The woman's voice broke the silence once more, softer this time. "My name is Aiyana." Caleb's gray eyes lifted to hers, steady as stone. He gave a slow nod. "Caleb," he replied simply. And that was enough. A name exchanged in the firelight, a bridge laid across the gulf of loneliness. The day broke sharp and bright, the kind of morning when the desert sky seemed endless and cruel all at once. Caleb Morton was tightening the reins on his old horse when the sound reached him, distant at first, then swelling, unmistakable. Hoofbeats. More than one. He straightened, squinting toward the horizon. A line of dust trailed across the mesa, growing larger with every heartbeat. His jaw set. Visitors weren't common out here. Uninvited ones never meant anything good. Aiyana stepped from the cabin, her shoulders still bound in rough cloth. She froze when she saw them. 3 riders, Apache warriors. Their faces were painted in streaks of black and red, their eyes cold as stone. The lead rider urged his horse forward, stopping just beyond the fence. His voice carried flat across the yard. "Our woman is here. Hand her over." Aiyana's breath caught. Her hand went instinctively to the small knife she kept at her side, fingers white around the hilt. Caleb moved before she could speak. He stepped forward, placing himself between the cabin door and the riders, rifle steady in his hands. His gray eyes locked on theirs, hard as steel. "She's injured," he said. "She'll stay here until she's healed." The second warrior snarled, baring his teeth. "She has been cast out. She has no right to live on this land. If you shelter her, you make yourself our enemy." The wind swept red dust across the yard. The air grew taut, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. Caleb didn't lower his rifle. "If you're looking to kill someone," he said, voice calm but deadly serious, "you'll have to start with me." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The horses stamped nervously, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Behind him, Caleb could feel Aiyana's presence, her fear and her fury colliding, but his stance never wavered. The lead warrior's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the spear in his hand. For a heartbeat, it seemed the yard would explode in violence. Then, with a sharp pull on the reins, he eased his horse back. "We will return," he spat, his gaze burning with hatred. "And next time, we will not come alone." With that, the 3 riders wheeled their horses and galloped off, dust rising in their wake until the horizon swallowed them whole. The yard fell silent again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm gathering. Aiyana gripped her knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Caleb turned back toward her, the fire still flickering in his eyes. "They'll come back," he said quietly. "With more." She lifted her chin, her dark eyes lit not with fear now, but with something fiercer, resolve. "Then we prepare," she answered. And for the first time since she'd set foot in his cabin, Caleb Morton knew she was no longer just a wounded refugee. She was choosing to stand and fight. The cabin walls groaned under the evening wind, dust sifting through the cracks as if the desert itself wanted in. Caleb Morton sat at the table, cleaning the old Winchester with steady, deliberate motions. Each click of the metal rang louder than usual. The silence between him and the woman across the room stretched tight. Aiyana sat near the fire, her long hair falling across her shoulders, her knife resting on her knee. She hadn't spoken since the warriors rode away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, but her mind was far beyond the cabin out on the mesa, where 3 riders had sworn to return with more. Caleb set the rifle aside and leaned forward, his voice low, rough as gravel. "Tomorrow won't be like today. They'll come back, and when they do, this place will turn into a battlefield." Aiyana lifted her gaze, meeting his with a calm that surprised him. He pressed on. "You don't owe me anything. If you want to leave before the sun rises, I won't stop you. But if you stay..." His words hung heavy in the firelight. "Everything changes." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Aiyana didn't flinch. She rose slowly, crossing the room until she stood in front of him. Her shadow stretched long across the floorboards, falling over his boots. Her voice was low, raw, but it carried with the weight of a vow. "If you don't touch me," she said, "I'll die in loneliness." The word struck Caleb harder than any threat of violence could. He looked up into her face and saw no weakness there, only the truth of a woman who had been left for dead by her own people, who had carried her shame and her silence through the desert. She wasn't begging. She was declaring. Aiyana straightened her shoulders, the firelight tracing the scars across her arms. "I choose to stay. Not because I am bound, not because I am weak, but because here, for the first time, I am seen." Caleb's gray eyes held hers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he gave the smallest of nods, as though sealing a pact neither of them needed to sign. He stood, walked to the window, and peered out into the black horizon. The desert was quiet, but he could feel the tension rolling across it, the certainty that riders would return. He turned back, voice calm, unshaken. Then we prepare. Together they dragged out old sandbags from the shed, stacked them by the windows, and patched gaps in the fence line with whatever wood they could find. Aiyana worked without complaint, sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking down her arms, her strength no longer hidden but alive with purpose. Caleb hammered boards in place, the rhythm of labor carrying them into the night. By lantern light, they moved as two instead of one. Not savior and saved, not rancher and refugee, but partners bound by choice. And in that choice, a new fire began to burn one the desert wind could not put out. Dawn came painted in bronze, the kind of morning that made the desert look like hammered metal under the rising Sunday. Caleb Morton had been awake long before the rooster crowed, his Winchester loaded, his boots planted firm on the porch. Every muscle in his body was taut, waiting. The sound arrived first hoofbeats, many more than before. A cloud of red dust rose over the ridge until it spilled into the valley below. 50 riders strong, maybe more, fanned out, encircled the ranch in silence. From the open gate, a path was cleared. Down that path rode an elder with silver hair braided long, a cloak of deer hide resting across his shoulders. His face was carved by time and weather, as stern as stone. Beside him came two older women, matriarchs of the tribe, their dark hair streaked with gray, their gazes sharp enough to cut. Aiyana stepped out from the cabin, no longer behind Caleb but beside him. Her shoulder was still bound, yet she stood tall, her scars bare in the morning light. For the first time, she did not hide them. The elder woman's voice rang clear. Aiyana, daughter of the tribe, today we ask for the last time. Do you return and face judgment, or do you choose exile? The words hung in the air, heavy as the desert sky. Caleb glanced sideways at her, but said nothing. This was her battle to fight. Aiyana drew a breath, the kind that filled her chest with more than air, with defiance, with life. The wind caught her hair, tossing it like a dark banner. I will not return, she said, her voice steady. I was punished for not bearing children. That is no crime. I will not bow to it. I choose life, my own life. Murmurs rippled through the warriors. Some shifted uneasily in their saddles. Others gripped their spears tighter, fire still burning in their eyes. The elder man's gaze bore into her. If you speak this, then your name is struck from our lineage. You will no longer be a daughter of the tribe. You will not be buried in sacred ground. From this day on, you are dust. Aiyana did not flinch. Better dust of my choosing than chains of yours. Silence spread wide across the circle. Then the second elder woman raised her hand, her tone final. From this day forward, the tribe will not hunt you, but you are nothing to us. The old chief turned his gaze to Caleb. You sheltered her. Her fate is now bound to yours. If she sheds blood, it will be on your hands. Caleb's gray eyes did not waver. I understand. The horn sounded. One by one, the riders turned their horses and withdrew, the thunder of hooves rolling over the horizon until only dust remained. Aiyana's shoulders trembled, but her eyes were alight, fierce and unbroken. Caleb looked at her a long time, then gave a slow nod. You just chose a new life, he said. Her voice was rough, but proud. No, Caleb, I chose myself. The dust had barely settled after the riders vanished, but the silence they left behind was heavier than the thunder of their hoofs. Caleb Morton lowered his rifle, the weight of it still clinging to his hands. Across the yard, Aiyana stood as if rooted in the earth, her chest rising and falling with each sharp breath. The council's words echoed in the empty air. You are dust, you are nothing to us. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Aiyana turned slowly toward Caleb. Her eyes were dark pools of fire, but deep inside, he saw the flicker of something else. Fear, raw and cutting. They cut me from my people, she said, her voice low, almost breaking. No mother, no sisters, no grave waiting for me. I am nothing now. Caleb shook his head, stepping closer. You're alive. That's not nothing. She looked away, her jaw tight. The desert wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. It was the look of someone who had walked through death and found herself unwanted on both sides of it. Inside the cabin, Caleb poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table in front of her. She didn't touch it. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. "When I buried my wife and boys," he said quietly, "I thought I was cut off too. Thought the world had no more use for me. But being alone doesn't mean you're gone. Sometimes it means you get to start again." Her gaze snapped to his, sharp as a blade. "Start again, as what? A ghost with no name?" Caleb met her fire without flinching. "As someone who doesn't need their permission to live." The words hung there, simple and heavy. Aiyana's hands trembled, then steadied as she wrapped them around the tin cup. She drank, slow and deliberate, as if the bitter taste of the coffee was proof she still belonged to the living. That afternoon, she walked the yard with him, her steps stronger, her eyes sharper. Together they patched the fence where the horses had trampled, their tools clanging against wood and stone. Each strike of the hammer, each lifted board was more than repair, it was a declaration. The ranch would stand, and so would they. When the sun began to sink, turning the sky the color of blood and fire, Aiyana leaned on the fence post, sweat streaking down her face. She stared out at the horizon where her people had vanished. Her voice was steady now, quiet but certain. "They may have taken my name, but they cannot take my breath, and they cannot take my choice." Caleb nodded, gray eyes softening. "Then you're not nothing. You're free." For the first time since he had found her in the dust, a faint smile touched her lips. Small, fragile, but real. And in that moment, under the dying light of the desert sun, two lost souls stood no longer as ghosts but as people reborn. For weeks, the sky had been a lid of brass, the land cracked and brittle beneath it. Each day the sun pressed harder, baking the soil, bleaching the bones of cattle that had wandered too far. Caleb Morton had stopped looking to the heavens for mercy. Rain hadn't come to Dry Creek in months. But that afternoon, the air shifted. The wind carried the scent of something wild, sharp, and electric. The horizon grew dark, not with dust, but with clouds thick as iron. Caleb stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers, and lifted his face to the sky. Aiyana emerged from the cabin, her hair loose around her shoulders. She paused on the porch, eyes narrowing at the rolling thunder above. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Then the first drop fell cool, heavy, striking the earth like a blessing. Another followed, and another. Within minutes, the plateau was swallowed in rain. Caleb stood still, letting it soak through his shirt, run down the lines of his face. The smell of wet earth rose around him, rich and alive. He hadn't realized how much he missed that smell until now. Aiyana stepped off the porch slowly, as though afraid it might vanish if she moved too fast. Rain streaked her skin, mingling with the old scars across her shoulders. She tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and spread her arms wide. The water washed away the dust, the dried blood, the last traces of the desert's cruelty. Caleb watched her from a few paces away. He had seen her broken in the sand, seen her fight like a cornered wolf, seen her stand tall before her people and be cast aside. But here, in the downpour, he saw something else. Not a ghost, not an outcast, but a woman reborn. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the softening ground. When she opened her eyes, she found him there, rain dripping from his hat brim, gray eyes steady on her. "You can leave now," he said quietly, almost lost beneath the roar of the storm. "They won't hunt you anymore. The road south will take you to town." She studied him for a long moment, rain coursing down her face. Then she asked, her voice calm but searching, "And do you want me to leave?" Caleb didn't answer at once. The rain filled the silence between them, steady and unrelenting. At last, he shook his head. "No, I think this ranch, it's no longer meant for one man alone." Aiyana's lips curved not into the fierce line of defiance he had seen so often, but into something softer, rare. A smile. The first since he had carried her out of the desert. Together, they worked through the storm, clearing the yard, shoring up the fences, turning over the soil that now drank deep of the long-awaited water. By the time the clouds broke and sunlight returned, the land smelled new, cleansed, alive. So did they. The desert night carried a rare stillness after the storm, the kind that felt earned. The rain had washed every stone, every fence post, every breath of air. The earth still glistened with patches of water, soaking into the cracks like veins carrying life back into a parched body. For Caleb Morton, standing on the porch of the Dry Creek Ranch, it was as if the land itself had been reborn and in some quiet way. So had he. The lantern burned low inside the cabin, its glow spilling warm and golden across the yard. Beyond it, the fences stood straighter than they had in years, braced with new timbers driven into wet ground. The soil was dark and heavy, promising grass where only dust had grown before. Caleb drew on his cigarette, the ember flaring, his gray eyes scanning the horizon. For once, he wasn't searching for danger. He was simply looking at a land that, for the first time in years, seemed to belong to him again. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Aiyana stepped out, barefoot on the damp boards, her hair loose and damp from the storm. The scars across her shoulders gleamed faint in the moonlight, no longer hidden, no longer a mark of shame but of survival. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the yard with the quiet pride of someone who had fought to stand in this place. Caleb glanced over. "Storm broke hard," he said. His voice carried a rough edge, but not the sharpness of fear, more like wonder, worn and cautious. Aiyana's lips curved slightly. It washed the dust away. They stood together in silence, listening to the night. Somewhere far off, coyotes called to each other, their voices carrying across the open mesa. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke, rich and heavy, like a memory they both wanted to hold on to. Aiyana lowered herself onto the porch steps, the old blanket draped loosely around her shoulders. She set her knife beside her, not clenched in her hand, but laid down openly, a choice. Caleb leaned against the railing, crossing his arms, the cigarette glowing between his fingers. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire inside. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying more weight than any shout. "If you hadn't touched me that day, if you had left me in the sand, I would have died in loneliness." The words struck him harder than he expected. Caleb looked at her, really looked. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, sprawled in the dust, her body broken, her pulse faint. He hadn't known then why he picked her up, why he carried her across the desert. But now, standing here, hearing those words, he knew. He let the smoke drift from his mouth before answering. "Truth is, I think I would have died the same way, just slower." Her eyes lifted to his, the firelight catching the depth in them. No suspicion lingered there now, only a fragile trust born out of nights spent in watchful silence and days of labor side by side. Aiyana reached down and touched the knife, then pushed it farther away from her. The gesture was small, but to Caleb it spoke louder than any vow. She no longer needed the blade between them. He pushed himself off the railing and stepped down into the yard. The soil was soft beneath his boots, damp from the rain. He picked up a heavy timber lying near the corral and shouldered it with a grunt. Aiyana rose without hesitation and crossed to him, bracing the post as he drove it into place. The sound of hammer on wood echoed sharp through the night, not as a warning but as a declaration. They worked together like that for hours, side by side beneath the silver moon. She carried stones to brace the posts. He tightened wire along the fence. Their movements were wordless, but in rhythm, the rhythm of two people no longer bound by survival alone, but by something steadier. By the time the last post stood firm, sweat and rain streaked both their faces, but neither seemed tired. They stood in the dark yard, breathing hard, and for once the silence between them was full, not empty. Aiyana laid a hand on the new post, her fingers pressing into the damp wood. Her voice was low but certain. "This is home now." Caleb met her gaze, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. He nodded slowly. "Ours." They returned to the porch. He tossed the spent cigarette into the mud, while she pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but its glow filled the room with warmth. Caleb opened the door, letting her step in first, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like his house alone. That night they sat by the fire, bowls of stew between them, the shadows playing across their faces. Aiyana leaned back, her eyes half closed. and whispered, not as a plea, but as a truth already lived. You touched me, Caleb, and I lived. He reached for his glass, his hand steady, and gave her the smallest of smiles. And I ain't letting go. Outside, the desert stretched wide and unforgiving. But within those four wooden walls, under the weight of scars and storms, something had been born. Not out of bloodlines, not out of duty, but out of choice. Two ghosts had walked the desert. Now, together, they had chosen to stop wandering. And in the heart of Dry Creek, a true home had been built not of nails and wood alone, but of courage, trust, and the refusal to let go. When the storm finally broke and the rain touched the desert, Caleb and Aiyana stood on soil that no longer felt cursed. They had each carried their ghosts into that cabin, his grief for the family he had buried, her scars from a tribe that cast her aside. Yet through quiet choices and stubborn courage, they found something that neither expected: a second chance. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest land, new life can grow when two people refuse to give up on each other. The heart of this tale lies not in battles or thunder of hooves, but in the everyday strength of compassion. Caleb could have walked past her in the dust, just another body left behind by the desert. Aiyana could have yielded to exile and silence. Instead, both chose differently. And that is the lesson worth remembering. Our dignity is not given by others, it is claimed in the choices we make, even when the world calls us broken. For those of us who have seen many seasons, the message is clear. Loss and loneliness may write their chapters in our lives, but they do not end the book. A small act of mercy, a hand held steady, can open doors we thought were closed forever. Perhaps you, too, have faced your own drought years when the horizon felt empty and the nights too long. Stories like this remind us that healing is found not in grand gestures, but in steady companionship, in the courage to rebuild fence by fence, day by day. So, as you carry this story with you, let it stir a memory or a hope. Ask yourself who has stood by your side in your hardest seasons and whom you might stand beside now. And if this tale touched your heart, don't wait, subscribe to the channel today. That simple act keeps these Wild West stories alive, riding out across the plains to reach others who need them. Together, we can keep the lantern burning, so no one walks through the desert night alone.